Diyan! Hello mga kameta! Kamusta kayo dyan? Sabi ko bago mag-evening, enjoy natin itong natural light dito para di na tayo gagastos sa lighting systems and all. Kamusta kayo dyan? Mga kameta, sorry kakatapos ko lang ng isang talk dito kanina sa Makati area. Meron kaming conference kanina with folks at the Strat Base and all. Pinag-usapan namin China, pinag-usapan namin yung geopolitics. Of course, kasama po natin si Admiral Ong at saka si Richard McGregor, isang very, world-renowned China journalist before ng base ngayon sa Lowy Institute. So, talagang buong hapon, busy tayo doon. Kung gusto niyo mga highlights ng mga presentation namin kanina, kasi hindi siya fully on the record, pwede ko i-post dito yung mga media coverage dun sa mga comments natin. So maraming kaming pinag-usapan, no? In particular, of course, in my case, I presented a snippet of my new paper on Philippine-Australia relations because sa tingin ko yung relasyon natin with Australia has been very under-tapped. It's a special relationship but very under-tapped, not much trade, not much investment compared to its potential. Not many Filipinos studying Australia as much as Malaysians or Singaporeans and vice versa. And of course, mga kameto, gusto natin makita na yung security cooperation natin with Australia to go into a higher gear para hindi lang tayo dependent sa US, para mag-diversify tayo with other potential partners. And pagdating naman sa Australia, they very much have similar strategic goals with us, whether it's on Taiwan, whether it's on South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, among other issue. And yung mga Australians, even though yung mga attack sa kanila ay supposedly mga deputy sheriff lang sila ng US, sunod-sunuran lang daw supposedly ng US. Actually, that's not true. No? They have acted very quite independently over the years. And even especially under Malcolm Turnbull, they stood up to Trump. Nung mga unilateralism ni Trump, yung mga anti-free trade shenanigans si Trump, Australia stood up to that. So Australia, I think, is a very interesting partner that we can work more with. Of course, in ways that enhances our national security and our national interests and gives us more options beyond United States. Kasi ay talaga natin na purong US lang or purong China lang. We want to diversify away from that. So I think our relationship with Australia is a very important one. Now, obviously kanina, pinost natin yung article natin for today sa Philippine Daily Inquirer, which is about yung issue ng charter change. Katulad ng sinabi natin mga kameta, inimbita tayo ng Committee on Constitutional Amendments sa Kongreso recently to give a presentation. I was not able to attend the latest one. There's an upcoming one, but unfortunately I may not be able to attend it because I will have overseas commitments. Kaya I gave a snippet of what I think is very important pagdating dun sa discussion ng constitutional change or charter change sa Pilipinas. Sa akin naman mga kameta, without taking a stance of whether for or against, there are three key positions that they raise, questions that they raise, that I think is very important before we jump into the issue. Now, una-una gusto kong sabihin na pagdating sa Pilipinas, unfortunately, we inherited not the good things from America. And one of the bad things that we inherited from America is what one legal scholar terms as procedural fetish. The idea of procedural fetish is pagdating sa diskusyon ng politika and governance natin, masyado tayong obsessed about ano yung mga batas, paano na isulat ng batas, anong klaseng constitution na dapat meron tayo. Mahalaga yan. Tsaka yung, of course, protocols, SOPs, etc. I'm not saying they're not important, but we have an obsession about that, and that's why in the Philippines, lawyers tend to dominate a lot of aspects of our political life, including governance, which is not the case in many other countries. So if you go to China, for instance, a lot of their leaders have engineering backgrounds. It's the same thing in many other countries whereby their leaders come from very diverse background, technocratic, intellectual, so very few lawyers tend to end up as presidents or top officials in some of the other countries around the world. So the Philippines is a very lawyerly country, and I think that's very much an American legacy. And because of that, we tend to obsess over ano yung naisulat sa batas without asking the bigger question, because it's one thing to pass a law, it's another thing to make sure yung batas na yan ay implementable ba? Meron ba tayong kapasidad at kakayahan na ma-implement yan? Kaya sabi ko, and this will be really the gist of my discussion, what we tend to always forget in the Philippines is the importance of bureaucracy or state capacity. Because you can have the best laws in the world, but if you don't have the capacity to enforce it, ano lang yan? Baliwala lang yan. But anyways, before going to that, let me just give my preliminary stance on the whole charter change debate. No, so yung column natin today, charter change, much ado about nothing, question mark. My argument is this, no? Of course, I quote Edmund Burke there and all. Pwede nyo check yung point ni Edmund Burke is better to be, reprimanded for being too anxious about something than being essentially sabog and bara-bara and then later regretting it. No. Now, going back to this, mga kameta, there are three different issues that I raise. Just about the debate per se, not even the content of the debate. The first thing we have to ask ourselves is, ano ba talagang gusto natin mangyari dito? At what do we really mean by certain key terms? Because, mga kameta, when you talk about constitutional change or charter change, what you're talking about really is the legal architecture undergirding yung itsura ng gobyerno mo and essentially ano ay yung form ng gobyerno na meron ka. But when you talk about political system, it's something much, much bigger. Political system is essentially the nature of the relationship between the governing class or the ruling elite on one hand and the broader society. Or to make it much more neutral, political system is about the nature of the relationship between the state and the society. So, to give an example, to see the distinction between the two, there's an overlap, but a constitution is just part of the political system. It is not the definition of a political system. So for instance, in a political system, it's a spectrum. So, on one extreme, you can find a country like North Korea kung saan everything is completely top-down, right? Halos walang input ang ordinary citizens sa North Korea pagdating sa big decisions of the state. It's really all the Kim Jong-un, Kim dynasty, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you can have a much more participatory democracy, and the best examples we have are countries like Switzerland or Scandinavian countries. So when you talk about political system, is the general nature of the relationship between the state and society, or whoever is in charge of the state and the broader society or the citizenry, right? So when you talk about charter change, you're just talking about the legal architecture that shapes the form of the government. But that's just a small part of the bigger issue, which is the political system. So you can have a political system that is much more participatory, but in completely different forms of government, right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The definition of terms is very, very important. So when you talk about parliamentary, presidential, you're really talking about forms of government. You're talking about legal architecture. You're not talking about the entirety of the political system. Because political system is about the nature of the relationship. Is it top-down or is it more participatory? And it's a spectrum. Some countries are more participatory, some countries are more top-down. So North Korea at one extreme, then you have China, then you have Russia, and then here maybe you have US, here a bit Philippines, and then here you have Switzerland and Scandinavia, and then you have South Korea, Taiwan. So you can put a spectrum here and look at countries how they fall. Are they more towards participatory democracy or more towards top-down dictatorship or authoritarian system? So that's the first thing you have to keep in mind. So a charter change debate is fundamentally not about political system in its entirety, but about just the legal architecture that shapes the form of government. So we're talking about form of government rather than really political systems in general. That's just the basic thing we have to keep in mind, mga kameta, right? Now, the second question I have is this. Ano ba talagang gusto natin mangyari dito? Because are we pushing for constitutional change or charter change because meron tayong problema sa ating demokrasya? For instance, marami tayong political dynasties, marami tayong oligarchs. Okay, if that's your problem, because I have a problem also with that, now tell me, do we need a new constitution to deal with that, or can't we deal with that with our existing constitution? Because we already had three other, we had constitution under Marcos, we had constitution in the Commonwealth period. So ang dami natin naging saligang batas over the past 100 years. And yet, the problem of political dynasties and oligarchies are still there. So there's no... So, in fact, parang lumala pang at some point in the past, ni mga cronies ni Marcos, for instance, in the 70s and 80s, no? So, for me, ano bang what is really your objective here? Because if you want to deal with political dynasties and all, then what we need is to pass an anti-dynasty law, enabling law, sa ilalim ng existing constitution natin. It's not like the 1987 Constitution is against anti-dynasty law. It's the trapos who don't want to pass that law. And it was the mistake of those who framed the Constitution not to ensure that we had an automatically enabling law against political dynasties. Now, if your problem is political parties, wala tayong totoong political parties, well, then pass an anti-defection law to make sure na walang butterfly effect. Do you get what I'm saying? Because you have to first tell me what is the exact problem you want to solve, and then accordingly ask, do you need a whole new constitution for that, or can't we not deal with it with the existing constitution that we have? Right? That's the second question I have. No? So you have to prove to me that the existing 1997 Constitution does not provide an avenue for anti-dynasty and pro-political parties. And that only with charter change we can do that. Right? That's the second question that we have to answer here. No? Now, going to the third level, what I'm saying here is that the form of government may or may not be important. So for instance, I always give these examples. Turkey, South Korea, and France. No? Three countries with very similar presidential, parliamentary, dominant presidential system. No? So in all three countries, you have a parliament, you have a prime minister, you have a president, and in all three countries, the president is a dominant figure. Right? So Macron in France, Erdogan in Turkey, and whoever is the latest president in Korea. Right? By the way, nasa Seoul ako last year, so napuntahan natin yung bagong president. But anyway, and yet, if you look at it, all three countries have had more or less similar form of government over the past decade or so, especially since Turkey went from parliamentary to presidential, which by the way shows you that when you have a parliamentary system, there's no assurance that it will not be co-opted, right? Case of Turkey is very important, right? You have a parliamentary system and it's co-opted from within. Next thing you know, you have a dominant president. It used to be more ceremonial when Gül was the president of Turkey, right? Abdullah Gül. And then Erdogan later on made the office of president very powerful, so it became a dominant presidential parliamentary system, very similar to Korea and France. And yet, all have very similar forms of government, but very different trajectories, right? So logically, if the form of government has a strong correlation with overall economic development and more democracy, then why on earth don't we see a convergence among those three countries? If anything, Turkey has been moving in a totally different direction. The economy is in a meltdown. They barely have a democracy left there. On the other hand, France, stagnation, economic stagnation, and a degree of political dynamism, right? So it used to be the far right under Marine Le Pen, who used to be a threat. Now it's the far left under Mélenchon, who's trying to challenge the center. But so far, the centrists under Macron are holding the line in France, right? Now, you go to Korea, it's a totally different system. Their democracy is very vibrant despite all their problems and all. Pinakulong nila yung mga presidente na corrupt. That's how much accountability they have. And their economy is extremely dynamic, extremely dynamic. So for me, if you want charter change because you want to make your economy more dynamic and all, or to make your democracy more vibrant, then maybe just changing your form of government may not be enough, because Turkey has a very similar form of government to France and to South Korea over the past 10 years, and yet its trajectory is totally different. So if you use your logic, right, if form of government has a strong correlation with economic development and democratization, then it should be the case that Turkey, Korea, and France are moving in a similar trajectory, which is exactly the opposite of that. They are moving in a totally different trajectory. So that just tells you that the correlation is at best weak and tenuous. No? Now, again, just to be clear, I'm not saying the form of government doesn't matter. So, for instance, my former professor Clarita Carlos has said that forms of government could also shape the like the expression of the government. Actually, more like Aristotelian, no? Form shapes the expression of substance. That's what Aristotle said in his philosophy. So I'm not counting out the possibility that changing the form of our government may eventually change the political system. But whether that correlation is strong, I just don't see enough evidence, right? And for anyone to say you just change the form of government and everything will be okay or everything will significantly change, it's like saying, pag nakalabas yung dila mo, pag nag-shoot ka na, tapos nakasuot ka ng Jordan shoes, maging kasing galing mo si Michael Jordan. Parang ganun, di ba? Hindi naman, but you get what I'm saying. Like, wearing a Nike NBA shoes doesn't necessarily make you an NBA level player, right? It goes far beyond that. Again, I'm not saying hindi kailangan ng charter change per se. I'm just saying wag natin i-exaggerate yung potential effect ng charter change, whether positive or negative. But more importantly, alam mo naman natin ang talagang reason to push for charter change ay potentially dalawa. On one hand is to make the Philippines more democratic and more economically developed because napag-iwanan tayo ng mga kapitbahay natin, that's on one hand. On the other hand, alam natin, may ulterior motive yung iba. Especially yung mga trapo dyan na gusto nila na only political terms, no? So, let's talk the second one first. So, if you look at it, maraming mga versions ng charter change nandyan na clearly are not prioritizing national development or making the Philippines more democratic. If anything, some of the bills there or proposed bills there are going for totally removing any term limit for political for incumbents, which will likely make the situation remain as bad, if not worse, right? So, this is what you call the law of unintended consequences, because even if yung mga ibang proponents ng charter change have good intentions, and I believe there are many people who want charter change and they really want the best for the country, but if yung gagawa mismo ng charter change ay yung mga trapo na ayaw mo to begin with, obviously they're gonna hijack the process, right? It's like, I'm looking at metaphors na hindi mean, diba? But, do you get what I'm saying? So, obviously, if you want to change the system for the best, you want the best people to also oversee that change. Because if not the best people oversee the change, baka ang lalabas ay hindi yung change na gusto mo, ang lalabas yung change na gusto nila. So, charter change just could be a fig leaf for ulterior motives and other agenda, which could make the problem even worse. And this goes to really my fundamental contention. My fundamental contention is this. If you look at the entire history of modernity, especially of industrialization of the past 100 years or so, all late capitalist countries na successful, beginning with Prussia, Germany, Imperial Japan, and then later on more new industrialized countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and then now you have Vietnam and China. Look at it, they have totally diverse forms of government. In fact, they have even totally different regimes, right? So Germany and Imperial Japan had a very different political regimes from, let's say, Taiwan or South Korea or Vietnam and China. Vietnam and China are not even parliamentary, presidential, or any of that. They're communist single-party rule, right? And have you noticed, all of them are successful economically. Prussia and Imperial Japan late 19th century, Japan again after Second World War, Korea since 1960s and 70s, Taiwan also the same, and then you have Vietnam in the past 20-25 years, so on and so forth, no? And then a little bit less dynamic but still as inspiring, you have cases of Malaysia, blah, blah. So my point is, if you look at what is common among all of these successful countries, is this. They all have capable, meritocratic, and patriotic state bureaucracy, right? So in the case of Japan, for instance, they had the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, no, MITI, which was extremely crucial to making sure that Japan negotiates the best possible trade investment deals so that they can get the best technology and capital, and at the same time they'll be able to build their industries, export, earn money for their country, and move forward. Korea has its own version. China has almost has a ministry almost with the literally same name. Vietnam also very similar. And if you look at a lot of these countries, they have all cultures of civil service excellence. And in the case of East Asia, this has to do with the Chinese civilization's Mandarin culture. So as you know, ancient China essentially invented what we today understand as a bureaucracy, right? Which is, makakapasok ka sa gobyerno kung nakapasa ka ng isang very difficult civil service examination, and then ma-promote ka sa loob ng gobyerno if you pass, if you have a certain high performance, no? That was invented in China almost 2,000 years ago. Now, over the next 1,000 years or so, kinakopycat ng ibang bansa yan. And interestingly, Europeans, from Leibniz to Voltaire, look at what they had to write about China. They were all amazed with the Chinese system of civil service, the mandarins, no? And later on, the Germans will copy that, the Europeans will copy that. And if you look at cases like Germany in the late 19th century, and then Imperial Japan, of course, in the case of Japan, they're also Confucian country. They were influenced by China a lot. Vietnam also very much influenced by China. Korea, the same. Taiwan, the same. Singapore, the same. All of them have a culture of civil service excellence. Now, bakit mahalaga yan? Because, mga kameta, politicians come and go. Politicians come and go. And politicians have their own agendas sometimes. Sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, sometimes both. But everyday governance happens under civil servants. Career diplomats in DFA. Technocrats in the Department of Finance, right? Yung mga nagtatrabaho dyan sa DSWD every day, whether under Erwin Tulfo, whether under Dinky Soliman, whatever. The point of the matter is this. We tend to forget that what makes a country run is actually the state bureaucracy. And yet, we are obsessed about elections, which is really about temporarily elected officials, right? Now, of course, mahalagang elections. Pero para sa akin, if you want long-term sustained development, you really need a bureaucracy that is empowered, that is capable, that is autonomous. And this is where it gets interesting. For you to have a dynamic private sector, you have to regulate the private sector properly to ensure that they pay their taxes, to ensure that they're serving the national purpose. So for instance, in China, in China, I may have some issues about some of the things that was done to the private sector recently, but the reason why the Chinese private sector is so dynamic is because the government constantly provides them incentives. The government constantly pushes them in the direction to be more innovative, to be more dynamic. That's why, for instance, China right now is creating cars as cool as Tesla. You think those electric car companies came out of nowhere? No. They came because of the incentive tax break systems and other kind of incentives that the Chinese government provided them. You think the chaebols of China, the Hyundais and LG came out of nowhere? No. They were there because the South Korean bureaucracy encouraged their oligarchs. Back in the day, LG, Samsung, Hyundai, they used to make toothpaste, right? They used to make, I don't know, whatever. But the government pushed them to get into heavy industries and later on into high-tech industries. No? So ang tawag dyan is developmental state. A state that pushes its oligarchs and entrepreneurial class to build world-class businesses that create jobs, brings in money, and sustains national development. Korea did it in no time. Taiwan did it. Japan did it under Zaibatsus. You have the chaebols in Korea. In Taiwan, it's much more small and medium enterprises driven, but still very dynamic. They have the world's biggest chip-making semiconductor industry. None of that was possible if not for incentive systems and support and regulation by their government. China is doing that. So all of these countries, very different political systems, very different political regimes, and very different forms of government. Single party, yung isa presidential parliamentary, yung isa parliamentary, di ba? Japan is parliamentary, yung isa presidential parliamentary, yung sa Korea. Very diverse, but all of them have one thing in common, which is a strong bureaucracy with a culture of civil service excellence. And the influence of Confucian China is very clear there. But we see, even outside China, in other civilizations, in other regions of the world, you also have very successful countries because they also had very active and successful civil servants and all. Now, remember, Japan did not have a world empire like Britain or France. Britain and France, their advantage was that because they had colonies all around the world, they could create a lot of wealth out of slavery and exploitation. The United States also had a big advantage because for hundreds of years, it was exploiting slaves. So it had free labor for a very, very long time. That gave them a heads up in terms of industrialization. Pero yung mga resource-poor countries or yung mga isolated countries or countries without much big empire, I'm talking about Prussia in the late 19th century, I'm talking about South Korea in the 60s and 70s, I'm talking about tiny Taiwan in the 70s and 80s, I'm talking about pre-super empire, Imperial Japan, etc. If you look at all of these things, all of them had one thing in common. They had a developmental state driven by a competent bureaucracy that allowed them to have long-term planning, to tame the oligarchs, and to push the country in the right direction. All of these countries had their own oligarchs too, in one way or another. Samsung, in a way, they're also, So, but they were tamed and they were pushed necessarily there. So my point is this: sometimes we're having all of these debates, but we're forgetting what we're really missing. And my point is, this is the bad legacy we have from Americans, because the American political culture is very libertarian. It demonizes the state, right? Or the government. Bureaucracy is a negative term in America. But the reality is that almost all successful late developing countries were able to catch up because they had a developmental state. That's just the fact of the matter. This is what history shows us. Even if you look at, for instance, yung mga small, successful, dynamic countries, not necessarily industrious, but small and dynamic, like Dubai, for instance. You know, Dubai is Dubai today because they had a leadership and a bureaucracy that ensured they get the best investments from around the world, they diversify their economy, they properly regulate the private sector, they can plan long-term, they can look beyond oil. You know, all of these things, you need bureaucracy, you need civil servants to run that every day. You don't need a tatay who will magically solve your problems in 3 to 6 months. No, you need many kuyas and ates there as civil servants who will deal with issues of trade, investment, and commercial interest of the country over the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Because if you really want to be a first world country, it's going to take a generation or two at least of sustained, optimal policy making and regulation. And for that, you need way more than just rotating politicians. You need a strong civil service. And one of the big problems we have dito mga kameta sa Pilipinas is that marami tayong political appointees. People who get into government, nagiging assistant secretary, nagiging, director, nagiging USEC, without having any relevant background in the departments they entered. Like some of these people have no business to be there. I'm not gonna name names, but there are people who ended up in Bangko Sentral and like, what? Anong background nito, di ba? May alam ba ito sa macroeconomic policy? Bakit siya nasa Bangko Sentral? So, you see, that's the problem. We have to reduce the number of political appointees. We have to make sure that the best and the brightest get into government. And we have to make sure that they're paid well, they're compensated well, and that we value their job. So if you look at the success cases, the Department of Finance, for instance, and DFA, they have very hard examination to get inside, especially in sa career service of DFA. And they're paid decently and well when they're inside. They have a lot of it. And they're very, very smart people. And DFA is constantly among the cleanest, most efficient agency in the government, no? Arm of the state, no? And it's because there is a culture of civil service excellence. So sana yung meron tayo sa DFA, if this is happening in all major agencies of the government, and bawasan natin ang political appointees, we make sure we get the best and brightest through competitive examination, competitive meritocratic system, and we promote people not because gusto sila ni tatay or kuya or ate, no, because magaling sila, they met the targets, they move up, then so be it. I mean, look at Singapore, for instance. In Singapore, they push their top ministers to get training in the private sector sometimes so that they're much more efficient in their management of their departments or sectors. So it's very, very meritocratic. And by the way, if you look at a lot of these countries, over time, they became stricter and stricter with corruption, right? Now in Vietnam, a president had to step down because of corruption. In China, President Xi Jinping disciplined millions of corrupt people. In Japan, especially in Korea, maraming nakulong or nakulong and na-impeach na presidente because of corruption. They're dealing with that. So whether they're communist or democratic or presidential parliamentary, all of them also have developed a very strong culture of accountability. At least compared to super corrupt other countries that, you know, you can fill in the blanks. Now, kunyari democratic pero ano talaga, oligarchy. Anyway, mga kameta, I'm just simplifying to you what are the basic questions we have to ask even before getting into the whole debate on charter change. Because I think the problem we have in the Philippines is that we're a too lawyerly country. We have what one legal scholar, American legal scholar called, we have procedural fetish. And too many lawyers are dominating the political debate when they have zero idea about what really makes a country successful, right? And believe me or not, no, actually you don't have to believe me, you just read on your own. What we need is a strong bureaucracy. What we need, strong not yung Soviet Union style, no. Strong, capable, autonomous, and meritocratic. We need to make sure the best and brightest Filipinos look forward to working for top government agencies. As I said, DFA and Department of Finance are some of the success cases, but we need that on all other key departments of the government. It's only then that we can make sure that even if we get clowns as our leaders, elected leaders, we can check that because we have competent people to run the everyday governance. You know, the presidents can go and travel right and left. You know, they can go Magellan Jr. Who do you think runs the Philippines when Magellan Jr. is all around the world and circumnavigating the earth? It's the civil servants and bureaucrats, right? And we have to reduce the number of political appointees. We have to make sure that only people who pass the examination or people who have really relevant background become our top civil servants. That our assistant secretaries, undersecretaries are people who really have a relevant background. That people who are working in Bangko Sentral, all of them have a background in economics, development, or something along those lines, or at least public policy. Yun lang po. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much, mga kameta. Ayan, nag-rant tayo out of nowhere. Pakibasing article na pinost natin dyan. So, again so as I said, Aristotle said that form can shape the expression of substance. So, I am open to the argument that certain kind of constitutional amendment make the Philippines much more democratic and developmentally friendly. I agree with that. But let's not also exaggerate the importance of form of government, because political system is way more than just the legal architecture governing the shape and form of the government. No? And more than that, and this is more important, we have to make sure any constitutional change is shepherded by the right people. If trapos are in charge of charter change, then alam mo na anong lalabas yan, di ba? So, please lang, huwag kayong magpadala doon sa mga, alam nyo na this, yung mga soothsayers, yung mga, charmers, snake charmers, pag ginawa mo yan, automatically, maging Singapore na tayo. It's like saying, pag nakalabas yung dila mo, tapos naka-Michael Jordan ka, tapos nag-shoot kang ganun, kasing galing mo na si Michael Jordan. Parang ganun lang. Alright. Okay. Alright. Maraming salamat, mga kameta. Yung mga late dito, si Riza, late. Panoorin niyo ulit, sinimplify ko. Nawawala na yung natural light. So, I think it's perfect time to close this discussion. But let's have more discussion on this. Please read the article I posted. Among others, I'll write more and more on this. And by the way, maraming salamat sa Committee on Constitutional Amendments for your kind invitation to come. I look forward to joining you guys in some of the discussions again in the future, hopefully. But so far, I just raised some 3 fundamental questions. What do we mean by political system versus charter change? Number 2, what are we trying to solve here? And number 3, is the form of government as important as creating a strong bureaucracy in state? And that we should not forget that the success story of nations is based on having inclusive political and economic institutions. So how is charter change going to help that or make it worse? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves. Alright, mga kameta, and that's the question you have to ask those people who are saying, pag ganito tayo, Singapore na tayo, or pag ganito tayo, maging UK na tayo. And by the way, just look at parliamentary system. It works in some places, but in some places also it doesn't work. Look at how it is in Iraq, for instance. The parliamentary system is a mess. Or look at other parliamentary systems. Look at UK, look at Australia, look at Israel. Look at how many elections they have had over the past 3-4 years pa lang. Right? Tapos ito pa yung mga, especially UK and Australia, or like genuine democracies. Look at how messy their politics is. Now imagine if that's in a country which has really no culture of real political parties. Now, is charter change going to solve that? Or maybe we can just amend our existing laws, or maybe we should force our trapos to find to press an anti-dynasty law, right? Yun lang. Nagtatanong lang po. Maraming salamat, mga kameta. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much. And God bless. Oh, by the way, thank you again sa mga nagbigay ng support. Kay Brav Pitt, Senan Makalalad, Eden Olonan, Riz Annie, Jocelyn Lumberi. As always, thank you so much. Kay Mitch Tencho, Michael Uy. Thank you so much sa mga support nyo. Wala na yung mga natural lights. So, talk to you soon. God bless.